The human walked forward with purpose, ignoring the shocked stares from the other guests. He reached the center of the hall and bowed low, but his gaze never left Zara's. "Your Highness," he said, his voice steady and clear. "My name is Captain Ethan Cross. I come in peace, as an ambassador of Earth." The name Earth felt foreign to Zara. It was a small, relatively insignificant planet in the vastness of the galaxy. What could this man offer that the others couldn't? Why did he stand so confidently before her, when even the greatest of her suitors seemed to shrink in her presence? Zara's curiosity only deepened as Ethan continued. "I'm here because I believe that even in a galaxy full of powerful empires, there is still a place for those who fight with conviction, not just strength. Earth may be small, but we are resilient. We've survived wars, hunger, disease, and countless hardships. If you allow me, I would like to show you that there is more to a ruler than just power." There was a brief silence in the hall as Zara considered his words. A low murmur spread through the crowd. Who was this human to speak to her this way? Yet, as she looked at him, she saw something different. Unlike the others, Ethan wasn't trying to impress her with his wealth or military strength. Instead, he was offering something far more valuable: a sense of purpose, a connection that went beyond mere titles and power. Zara tilted her head, intrigued by his words. "You think humans have something to offer the galaxy?" she asked, her voice sharp but curious. Ethan didn't flinch. "I think humanity has something to offer everyone, Your Highness, and I believe you may find that something worth considering." Zara looked at him for a long moment, her mind racing. No one had ever spoken to her like this. No one had ever challenged her ideas so boldly, yet with such sincerity. It was then that Zara realized something. She hadn't rejected all her suitors because they lacked power. She had rejected them because they lacked heart, and Ethan Cross, the human standing before her, was the first person who had shown her that heart. The silence in the room was deafening as Zara studied Ethan's calm, steady expression. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of hope rise in her chest. The grand hall was still humming with whispers, but this time, the focus wasn't on Zara or her suitors. It was on Ethan Cross, the human who had just made a bold statement in front of the entire galaxy. For a moment, there was only silence as everyone tried to process what had just happened. Zara watched Ethan with a mix of surprise and curiosity. He had walked into her world, a world of grandeur and power, and spoken as if he belonged. But Zara wasn't easily impressed. She had met countless beings, each one more powerful and sophisticated than the last. What could a human, someone from a young and relatively weak planet, offer her? Despite her doubts, Zara found herself intrigued by Ethan. He didn't try to win her over with extravagant promises or showy displays of strength. Instead, he spoke about humanity's resilience, its ability to survive against overwhelming odds. His words resonated with her in a way she didn't expect. Maybe it wasn't the power or the riches that mattered after all. Maybe it was the strength of character, the will to fight and survive no matter the cost. Ethan stood in front of her now, his calm eyes locked with hers, waiting for her response. The rest of the hall was still, and it felt like the weight of the galaxy rested on her decision. Zara stood slowly, her gaze never leaving Ethan's. She had heard rumors of humans, of their determination, but she had never truly understood what made them different. Until now. She motioned for him to come closer. "Captain Cross," she said, her voice cold but not unkind. "You have the courage to speak to me in such a way. But I am curious. What makes you think that a human, someone from a planet like Earth, could ever stand beside me?" Ethan didn't hesitate. He took a step forward, his posture straight but relaxed. "Your Highness," he began, his voice steady, "Earth may be small, but we are survivors. Our history is filled with wars, disasters, and challenges. Yet we have always found a way to rise again. We don't rely on advanced technology or superior armies to win our battles. We rely on our will to survive and our ability to adapt. If you give me the chance, I can show you that the strength of a people is measured not by the size of their armies, but by the strength of their spirit. Zira's eyes narrowed slightly as she listened. His words were simple, but there was something raw and powerful about them. Something she hadn't heard from anyone else. The others had always talked about their strength, their fleets, and their power. But Ethan wasn't talking about any of that. He was talking about something deeper, something she hadn't realized she was missing. The grand hall was filled with the sound of soft whispers, the clinking of glasses, and the hum of excitement. Tonight was a night of celebration, but there was one thing everyone was focused on: the alien princess, Zoira. She sat on her golden throne at the center of the hall, surrounded by the most powerful beings in the galaxy. The air was thick with anticipation. Zira had been the center of attention for years, and tonight, her suitors would finally get their chance to win her favor. But despite the glittering array of powerful beings from every corner of the universe, warriors, diplomats, nobles, and conquerors, Zira looked uninterested. She was beautiful, with long silver hair that shimmered like moonlight, piercing blue eyes, and an elegance that radiated even without trying. However, her beauty and status were not the reason she turned heads. Zira's true power lay in her mind and her heart. Both were as fierce as they were mysterious. She was the heir to a massive empire, one that controlled dozens of planets, and yet she had rejected every suitor that had come her way. None of them had caught her heart. None had impressed her. Tonight, it was no different. One by one, the suitors approached, each with an offer of marriage or alliance. Some promised riches beyond imagination. Others offered vast armies, but Zira wasn't interested in any of it. She was tired of power-hungry men who only saw her as a prize to be won. The first suitor, a tall, golden-skinned alien from a distant star system, stepped forward. He bowed deeply, his eyes filled with admiration. "Princess Zira, I offer you the finest fleet in the galaxy. With my ships, we could conquer entire star systems together. You would rule beside me, and we would bring peace to the universe." Zira, without hesitation, looked him up and down before waving him away. "Peace?" she asked with a raised eyebrow. "You speak of peace, but your fleet has only ever known destruction. I will not marry a man who hides behind the power of his ships." The suitor stood frozen, clearly shocked, before bowing and retreating back into the crowd. More suitors followed, each offering gifts and promises of grandeur, each one rejected just as easily. Zira's eyes narrowed with each rejection, her heart growing colder with every failed attempt to find someone who could see her for who she truly was. Zira wasn't just the princess of an empire. She was a woman, a person who longed for something real, someone who understood her, someone who could love her without strings attached. She didn't want a ruler by her side. She wanted someone who would challenge her, who would fight alongside her, not because of her title, but because they believed in her. As the evening wore on, Zira grew more restless. The grand hall felt suffocating, the faces of her suitors blurring together in her mind. Each one was more insistent than the last, and yet none seemed to spark any true connection in her. What was the point of it all? And then, just as Zira was about to dismiss another would-be suitor, the doors to the hall opened with a soft creak. A hush fell over the crowd as the new arrival stepped inside. Zira's eyes immediately went to the newcomer, a human. At first, she couldn't believe her eyes. What was a human doing here, in the heart of her empire? Humans were still considered a relatively young species by galactic standards, their technology crude compared to that of other civilizations. They had only recently begun to explore space and make allies with other races. And yet, here he was, standing in the doorway as if he belonged. The man was tall, but not imposing. He had dark hair, worn slightly messy, and his eyes were a striking shade of green, full of confidence. He didn't have the golden armor or fancy robes like the others. Instead, he wore a simple suit of military uniform, which made him seem almost out of place among the highly polished alien nobility. Zira studied him with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Why was he here? Was this some sort of trick? Yet there was something about him that caught her attention. He didn't look intimidated by the grand hall or the aliens around him. His presence was calm, steady, almost as if he belonged. When their eyes met, Zyra felt a spark, a flicker of something she hadn't felt in years. Intrigue. The silence in the room grew thick as her words hung in the air. Ethan's gaze didn't waver as he looked at her, and for a moment, it felt like time had stopped altogether. He leaned forward slightly, his voice quiet but steady. "Zyra," he said softly, "you don't have to explain. I felt it too. But we're both aware of what's at stake. This empire, your people, they need you. And this, whatever this is between us, it can't come at the cost of that." Zyra's heart ached as she heard his words. She had known, deep down, that he would say something like that. He was right, after all. Their connection could be a dangerous distraction. The galaxy was at war, and she couldn't afford to let herself become vulnerable. But even as she thought about her responsibilities, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was something more than just a fleeting moment. This was real, and no matter how hard she tried to deny it, it was something she couldn't ignore. "I know," she whispered, "but I don't know what to do with this. What we have, I can't just forget it." Ethan didn't respond right away. He sat back, his eyes studying her as though he was trying to figure out the right thing to say. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. "Zyra," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "I'm not asking you to forget it. I'm just asking you to think. Think about the consequences of this. We both know the path you walk, and it's not one where love and personal feelings can always play a part. You have an entire empire to lead. Your people need you to be strong. And I'm not sure that this, whatever this is something you can afford to let change you." Zyra's chest tightened at his words. She had always known that leadership meant sacrifice. But hearing him say it out loud made it feel even more real. She couldn't be distracted. Not now, not when everything was on the line. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized that Ethan wasn't just saying this to protect her. He was protecting them both. If they gave in to this, whatever it was between them, it could tear them apart. It could ruin everything they had worked for. "I understand," she said softly, her voice tinged with sadness. "I can't afford to let this distract me. I have to remain strong." Ethan nodded, his expression unreadable. "And so do I." Zyra felt a lump form in her throat as she looked at him. There was so much left unsaid between them. So many feelings that had never been voiced. And yet she knew that this was the right decision. For both of them. She had to let go of whatever had begun to form between them, at least for now. As Ethan stood to leave, he paused by the door, glancing back at her. "Zyra, no matter what happens, I'll always have your back," he said quietly, "even if it's from a distance." With that, he left her quarters, leaving Zyra alone with her thoughts. The galaxy had not stopped moving. Despite the chaos of war, despite the lives lost, and the countless battles fought, life on Zyra's ship carried on. But for Zyra, nothing was the same anymore. The tension she had felt earlier had settled into something different now. She had made her choice, the painful choice to separate her emotions from her leadership. But every day it became harder to ignore the emptiness left behind. Zyra stood in the command center, watching the stars pass by as the ship moved through space. The long journey back to the planet where the treaty would be signed felt like an eternity. The mission was nearly complete, and yet, with every step forward, she found herself questioning if she had made the right decision. She had been forced to put her feelings for Ethan aside. But now, as she stood alone, she realized how much she missed him, how much he had come to mean to her in such a short amount of time. Despite their brief moments together, they had shared something that couldn't be easily forgotten. But Zyra knew that she couldn't dwell on it. She had a duty to her people, to the galaxy. Emotions had no place here. "Your Highness," a voice interrupted her thoughts. It was one of her officers, standing at attention. We are approaching the rendezvous point. The treaty delegation has arrived and is waiting to finalize the peace agreement. The leaders are eager to proceed. Zira nodded, masking the sadness she felt with the practiced professionalism that had always been her shield. "Thank you," she said, her voice calm. "Prepare the ship for docking. We must make sure everything is in order before we proceed." Zira didn't answer right away. She had fought for her people, for her future. But the price had been high, too high. And as she looked at the stars above, she knew that this was only the beginning. The galaxy was a dangerous place, and survival would be their constant companion. But for now, they had won. And that, in itself, was a victory. The victory was hard-won. The battle had been fierce, and though Zira's fleet had emerged victorious, the cost was greater than anyone had anticipated. The death toll was higher than she wanted to admit, and there were too many injured to count. The smell of burned metal and the acrid scent of destroyed ships lingered in the air as Zira walked through the command center. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of everything that had happened. The mission, the battle, the survival, it was all a blur, and yet she couldn't shake the feeling that something inside her had changed. Ethan had been by her side throughout it all. He hadn't hesitated for a second when the battle began. His calm under pressure had been the steady hand that guided her fleet when everything seemed like it would collapse. He fought alongside the soldiers, helping them in ways that seemed almost impossible for a human. It was like he had become part of the crew, one of them, even though he was an outsider. Zira had been noticing the subtle changes in herself ever since that first conversation with him. The way he looked at her, the way his calm voice brought her comfort in the midst of chaos. It was different from anything she had felt before. The more she worked alongside him, the more she realized that there was something between them, something that was growing stronger with every passing day. But she couldn't afford to let it show. She was the leader of an empire, and she couldn't let herself be distracted by emotions. There were decisions to be made, people to lead, and lives to protect. The burden of leadership was heavy, and she couldn't afford to let her personal feelings get in the way. Yet, despite her best efforts to push it aside, she found herself drawn to him. His quiet strength, his determination, his kindness, they all made him a different kind of man, a kind of man she had never encountered before. Zira sat in her private quarters, her fingers tracing the edge of a datapad as she reviewed reports from the battle. She had to make sure everything was in order. There were still countless tasks to manage, and her mind had to stay sharp. But her thoughts kept drifting back to Ethan. She tried to focus on the reports, on the numbers, on the war. But all she could think about was the way he had stood by her, how he had fought with her, and how his presence had somehow made everything feel just a little less impossible. The door to her quarters opened, and she looked up to see Ethan standing in the doorway. His eyes were tired, his face worn from the battle, but there was still a quiet strength about him. "You wanted to speak with me?" he asked softly. Zira nodded, her throat tight. She had to do this. She had to make things clear. She couldn't afford to let this feeling between them grow any further, not while everything was still so fragile. The galaxy was at war, and emotions like these could only lead to mistakes, mistakes that could cost lives. "Come in, Captain Cross," she said, her voice steady. She gestured for him to take a seat, though she remained standing herself. She needed distance. "There are things we need to discuss." Ethan stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He took a seat across from her, his posture still rigid, as if waiting for her to speak. Zira took a deep breath, trying to gather her thoughts. "Ethan, I've been thinking," she began, her voice calm but firm. "You've been a valuable asset to this fleet. Your help in the battle was invaluable, and I owe you my gratitude. But there's something else I need to address." She paused, searching his face for any sign of what he was thinking. "You've been by my side through all of this. You've fought alongside me. You've been more than just an observer. You've been part of this, and I can't ignore that." Ethan didn't say anything at first, but his eyes softened. "What are you trying to say, Your Highness?" Zyra's heart skipped a beat at the way he addressed her. She had always been Your Highness to him, but there was a part of her that wished he would just call her Zyra. It felt more personal that way, but she couldn't allow herself to go down that path. Not now. Not ever. "I'm saying that I'm conflicted," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've never felt this way before. Not like this. You've been with me through all of this chaos, and I've begun to realize something. There's more between us than just respect. I can't ignore it anymore." Zyra nodded, her mind already working on the strategy. "Then we move carefully. We'll show them that we're prepared, but we won't strike until we know we have to." The next few hours were filled with preparation. Zyra's advisors scrambled to assemble the fleet, ensuring that every ship, every soldier, was ready for what was to come. There was a sense of urgency now, as if the entire galaxy was holding its breath. The stakes had never been higher, and the weight of the moment settled on Zyra's shoulders like a heavy cloak. She stood at the command center of the ship, watching as the fleet was mobilized. Her fingers ran over the smooth surface of the table in front of her, her mind racing. She had never wanted war. Her entire life had been dedicated to building peace and stability. But now, peace seemed like a distant memory, a fragile dream that could shatter at any moment. Ethan stood beside her, his gaze steady as he watched the crew work. "Are you sure this is the right move?" he asked, his voice quiet. Zyra glanced at him, surprised by the question. "Of course it is. We have no choice. If we don't show them that we're ready, they'll take advantage of us. We have to act now." Ethan didn't reply right away. Instead, he turned to look at her, his expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking," he said slowly, "about how humans deal with war. We don't always fight the way others do. We don't always have the most advanced technology or the biggest armies. But we're relentless. We don't back down, no matter the odds. And sometimes, that's what wins wars." Zyra met his gaze, her eyes narrowing slightly. "I know how to win a war, Captain Cross. I've led fleets into battle before, but what you're talking about, it's different. It's more than just strategy. It's about survival, about pushing through when everything is against you." Ethan nodded. "Exactly. It's about knowing when to fight, when to stand your ground, and when to make the hard choices. The battle ahead won't be won by firepower alone. It will be won by those who are willing to sacrifice everything." Zyra felt a chill run down her spine as his words sank in. She had always relied on her training, her experience, and her people's strength to win battles. But Ethan was right. War wasn't just about tactics and numbers. It was about survival, about holding on to hope when everything seemed lost. Hours later, the storm they had feared finally arrived. A massive fleet of enemy ships appeared on the horizon, their dark silhouettes cutting through the stars like predators hunting their prey. The ceasefire had been a lie, a trap designed to lull them into a false sense of security. The leaders of the planet had indeed been waiting for the right moment to strike, and now they had chosen their time. Zyra stood in the command center, her heart racing as the alarms blared throughout the ship. She had known this moment would come, but nothing could have prepared her for the sheer magnitude of the threat. The enemy fleet was huge, and they were closing in fast. Her people were outnumbered, but she couldn't back down now. She had to fight. "Prepare for battle," she shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. "All hands to your stations. We're not giving up without a fight." The crew sprang into action, scrambling to their stations as Zyra took her position at the front of the ship. She could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on her as she gave the orders. She had to lead them through this. She had to make sure that her people survived. Ethan stood beside her, his hand resting on the console, watching the enemy fleet grow closer. "This is it," he said quietly. Zyra nodded. "Yes, but we won't go down without a fight. We'll show them what humanity is made of." The first shots rang out, and the battle began. The fight for survival was brutal. The enemy fleet came at them with everything they had, but Zyra's fleet fought back with a fury that surprised even the enemy. Every ship, every soldier gave their all, determined to protect their home, their people. There were casualties, yes, far too many, but each loss only made them fight harder, each sacrifice fueling the fire within them. Zyra's heart pounded as she watched the battle unfold. She had led countless missions, but this was different. This was personal. This was survival. And as the enemy ships fell one by one, she realized something. Ethan had been right. The fight wasn't just about strength. It was about survival. It was about the will to keep going, no matter the odds. The battle raged on for hours, but in the end, Zyra's fleet emerged victorious. The enemy, broken and scattered, retreated into the depths of space, leaving the survivors standing tall, battered but unbroken. As the dust settled, Zyra turned to Ethan, her expression unreadable. "We made it," she said, her voice hoarse. Ethan nodded, his eyes reflecting the exhaustion of the battle. Yes, but at what cost? Ethan, standing at the back of the room, observed quietly. He said nothing, but his eyes never left Zyra as she negotiated. He could see the strain on her face, the tightness of her posture, and the way she never wavered. But there was something else. Despite her confidence, Ethan could tell that the situation was more fragile than she was letting on. He had seen his fair share of tough negotiations back on Earth, but this was on another level. This was more than just politics. It was about life and death. The meeting dragged on for hours. Zyra remained calm, but it was clear that her patience was wearing thin. The leaders were starting to push her buttons, testing her limits. And then, just as things seemed about to explode, something unexpected happened. Ethan stepped forward, breaking the silence. "I think there's a way to resolve this," he said, his voice steady. "But it's going to require both sides to give something up. Your Highness, if I may." Zyra was taken aback. She hadn't expected him to speak up, not now. She knew he had been observing, but to take the initiative like this. She turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "Captain Cross, this isn't your place. These negotiations are mine." But Ethan didn't back down. He looked at the leaders and then back at Zyra. "Your Highness, you're right. This isn't my place. But sometimes the best way to lead is to step back and let someone else offer a solution. I've seen how you're holding yourself together, how you're trying to make everyone happy. But maybe, just maybe, it's time for you to trust them." Zyra's heart skipped a beat. Trust. Was that what this was all about? For the first time since meeting him, she felt something shift inside her. Ethan wasn't asking for power. He was asking for something deeper. He was asking her to trust the people she was trying to negotiate with, to step back and let them be part of the solution. It was a test, not just of him, but of her. And in that moment, Zyra realized something. This wasn't just about proving that humans could be strong. This was about proving that she could change, that she could be the kind of leader who didn't always have to control everything, but who could trust others to share the burden. The aftermath of the meeting was still heavy in the air. Zyra stood at the window of her quarters aboard the ship, looking out over the alien planet's landscape. The negotiations had been difficult, but they had reached a fragile peace. The leaders had agreed to a temporary ceasefire, but it was clear that the agreement was only a bandage on a much deeper wound. Nothing had truly been settled, and the tension was still palpable. She turned away from the window as Ethan entered her room. There was a new energy about him, something she hadn't noticed before. He walked toward her, his usual calm demeanor intact, but there was a quiet intensity in his eyes. "Your Highness," he began, his voice steady. "I know this isn't over. There's still a storm brewing beneath the surface. The leaders may have agreed, but there's something they're not telling you." Zyra raised an eyebrow, surprised. She hadn't expected him to be so perceptive. "You think so?" she asked, her voice calm, but carrying an edge of curiosity. Ethan nodded, his expression serious. I've seen it before. In every negotiation, there's always one side that's just waiting for the right moment to strike. These people are too proud to admit weakness. They'll be looking for a way to regain their power, and they won't hesitate to do whatever it takes. Zira stood in silence for a moment, processing his words. Ethan was right, of course. She knew it too well. She had always understood the fine line between peace and war, but it wasn't often that someone was brave enough to speak the truth so bluntly. Then what do you suggest? She asked, her voice low but filled with determination. Ethan stepped closer to her. We need to be ready. We need to prepare for the worst. If things do go south, we can't afford to be caught off guard. You need to secure your people, Your Highness. The fight is coming. Zira's heart raced at the realization that she had been too focused on the diplomacy of it all. She had been so caught up in managing the political landscape that she had forgotten one very important thing. War was always just a heartbeat away. And now she had to face the reality that peace could be shattered at any moment. She took a deep breath and turned to face him. I'll get the fleet ready, she said, her voice firm. Prepare the best soldiers. I don't want to take any chances. Ethan's expression softened, but there was a glint of admiration in his eyes. I'll help however I can. But remember, Your Highness, this won't be easy. The leaders we've dealt with here are dangerous, and their pride could be their downfall. But if we act too quickly, we risk making things worse. She had always prided herself on her ability to control everything around her. As the princess of an empire, she was expected to make decisions that affected millions of lives. But Ethan had made her question everything she thought she knew about power. His calm, quiet confidence had shaken her. And it wasn't just his words. There was something in the way he held himself, in the way he didn't need to boast or prove anything. He was a puzzle, and she couldn't help but want to figure him out. Zira decided it was time for a test, not just for Ethan, but for herself. She had to know if he was truly different from the others, if he could prove that the human spirit really was something to be reckoned with, and if he could pass that test, perhaps there was more to this human than she had thought. The opportunity came sooner than expected. Zira had been preparing for a diplomatic mission, an important one. She was to visit a nearby planet to discuss a peace treaty with a neighboring empire. The situation was delicate. One wrong move, and the entire alliance could be on the verge of war. Normally, she would have trusted only her closest advisors, seasoned diplomats, and military leaders to accompany her. But this time, she decided to invite Ethan, not as a diplomat, but as an observer. She wanted to see how he would react when faced with a real test of diplomacy and decision-making. The morning of the mission arrived, and Zira stood before her private transport ship, waiting for Ethan to arrive. The planet they were traveling to had a reputation for being unpredictable, with factions who were often at odds with one another. It was a place where words mattered, and where one wrong move could lead to disaster. Ethan was about to see firsthand how difficult it could be to rule a galaxy, to maintain control when everything seemed on the edge of collapse. When Ethan arrived, Zira nodded at him, a small but firm gesture of acknowledgement. Captain Cross, she said, her voice cool. I've invited you to accompany me today. This isn't a mission for diplomacy. It's a mission to see how you handle pressure. I want you to watch closely and see if you can truly understand what it means to be in charge. Ethan met her gaze with his usual calm demeanor. Understood, Your Highness. I'm ready. The journey to the planet was long, and the atmosphere aboard the ship was tense. Zira sat in silence for most of the trip, thinking about the events that were about to unfold. She had done this countless times before, dealing with politicians, negotiating peace treaties, managing expectations, but she had never invited a human along for the ride. And now she was wondering what Ethan would make of it all. As they neared the planet's atmosphere, Zira turned to Ethan. When we land, you will see the situation for what it is. This isn't just about talking. It's about survival. The leaders here are unpredictable, and their alliances shift like the wind. If you want to understand what power truly means, you will see it today. Ethan nodded, not speaking, but watching her closely. Zira wasn't sure what he was thinking. Did he believe he was ready for this? Or was he only here because he wanted to prove something to her? Either way, she couldn't afford to show any weakness. She had to remain strong, in control. She couldn't let Ethan, or anyone, see the cracks in her confidence. As the ship landed on the planet's surface, Zira could feel the tension in the air. The planet's capital was a sprawling city, surrounded by a vast desert. The buildings were ancient and beautiful, but they were crumbling, as if the weight of history had become too much to bear. There were few places in the galaxy where power was so volatile, where every word could be turned into a weapon. And today, Zira would need to use every ounce of her skill to keep the peace. The moment they stepped out of the ship, they were greeted by the planet's leaders. Their eyes flicked between Zira and Ethan, clearly curious about the human who was accompanying her. Zira didn't say anything about Ethan's role. She wanted to see how he would react, how he would navigate this situation on his own. The first meeting was tense. The leaders of the planet were stubborn, proud, and fiercely protective of their land. Their demands were unreasonable, and Zira knew that any misstep could lead to war. She spoke with calm authority, trying to steer the conversation in a direction that would benefit both sides. But the leaders were pushy, and their anger was evident. Zira could feel the weight of their glares, the pressure building with every word. Still, she wasn't ready to let him off the hook so easily. "And what do you expect from me?" she asked, her tone still distant. "Why should I take you seriously when I have so many other suitors who are far more powerful than you?" Ethan didn't flinch. He met her gaze head-on, his eyes never wavering. "I don't expect anything, Your Highness. I'm not here to compete for your hand or for your power. I'm here because I believe that humans and aliens alike can learn from each other. I believe that the greatest strength we have is the ability to look beyond our differences and fight together for a common cause." Zira's mind raced. She had always believed that her status, her empire, and her power were what defined her. It was how she was respected, how she held control over her people and the galaxy. But Ethan's words were starting to chip away at that foundation. Was she truly as powerful as she thought? Or had she been hiding behind her title, too afraid to face the truth of what she really wanted? She looked at him again, this time not as a suitor or a diplomat, but as someone who had come to offer something she had never considered before: an equal, a partner. For the first time in years, Zira found herself questioning her own beliefs. Just then, the door to the hall opened again, and an aide entered, interrupting the moment. The aide whispered something in Zira's ear, and she nodded. "Excuse me, Captain Cross," she said, turning back to him. "I must attend a royal meeting, but I would like to speak with you again soon." Ethan nodded, his expression unchanged. "I'll be here, Your Highness," he said, his voice calm and steady. As Zira turned to leave, she couldn't help but glance over her shoulder at the human. There was something different about him, a quiet confidence that no one else in the room seemed to have. His calm demeanor, his lack of desperation, only made her more curious. Who was this human, really? What was he hiding behind that calm exterior? Later that night, Zira couldn't sleep. Her thoughts kept drifting back to Ethan. She had never met anyone quite like him. His eyes, filled with determination and conviction, haunted her. She had spent her life surrounded by people who craved power, wealth, and control. Yet Ethan had no interest in any of that. He didn't need her empire to feel important. He wasn't there to conquer, to manipulate, or to play games. He was there because he believed in something deeper: the value of humanity, the strength of their spirit. Zira sat up in her bed, her mind racing. She had always thought that her people were the most advanced in the galaxy, that their technology, their armies, and their intellect made them superior. But now she was beginning to question that belief. Was her empire really the strongest, or had it just been lucky? Could humans, so much younger, so much smaller, be a real threat to her empire, not because of their weapons, but because of their resilience. She stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the vast expanse of stars. The night was calm, the galaxy stretching out in every direction, full of possibilities. It was in that moment, standing alone in the quiet, that Zyra realized something she hadn't before. She wasn't just a princess. She was someone who needed to learn, to grow. And maybe, just maybe, Ethan Cross was the person who could help her do that. The next day, Zyra summoned Ethan to her chambers. This time, she wasn't interested in playing games or making demands. She was curious. She needed answers. As he entered the room, she looked at him with new eyes. "I've thought about what you said," she began, her voice softer than before. "And I want to know more. What is it about humans that makes you so different?" Ethan smiled, a small but genuine smile. "I think, Your Highness, it's because we've learned to never give up. We're not perfect, and we don't have all the answers, but we keep fighting, no matter what." Zyra nodded slowly, absorbing his words. Maybe, just maybe, she could learn something from this human after all. The days following their conversation were filled with tension and anticipation. Zyra couldn't stop thinking about Ethan. His words had planted a seed of doubt in her mind, one she couldn't ignore. It was as if he had shown her a side of the galaxy she had never considered before, a side where strength wasn't just about technology or armies, but about resilience, determination, and the will to keep going no matter the odds.